Think we're ready to get going. Welcome to everybody. My name is Enrique Aleman Jr. I am the director of the Center for Educational Leadership and the Lillian Radford Endowed Professor of Education at Trinity University, Department of Education. Really happy to welcome everybody to our first speaker for 2022. We're very fortunate, and I'm very lucky to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon, who's an associate professor and coordinator of building and district leader graduate programs at Lehman College, which is in the City University of New York. She's also an affiliated doctoral faculty member in the Urban Education PhD program at CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Rivera McCutcheon began her career as a high school teacher in the Bronx before earning her doctorate at NYU. She's a first-generation college graduate, and her research is informed by experiences attending and teaching in New York City public schools. Dr. Rivera McCutcheon's work focuses on urban school leaders who practice radical care, which we're really excited to hear more about. Radical care centers anti-racism and equity as part of their leadership work. I know she's worked with a lot of school building leaders across New York City and in New York State. And she'll be talking specifically about this. I'm very excited about this. Like, I already got notes and everything. Her new book from Teachers College Press called Radical Care, Leading for Justice in Urban Schools, which was just published in 2021. And most importantly, she finishes up her bio. She's a mother of 3 Afro-Latinx children who attend public schools in New Rochelle, New York. I've known her for several years. I've been very fortunate to sit on panels and listen to her present at our national conference, typically in November. I missed her the last couple years, but hopefully we'll get a chance to do that again this coming November. And on a personal note, I think somebody who's older than her and came in earlier in the profession, it's just been good to have these kinds of perspectives that have been making school leaders and those professors who study school leadership really think about urban leadership, social justice leadership, authentic care, radical care in a much different way. And so it's just been a breath of fresh air, and it's been what the field has needed. And so I really appreciate that she's provided that perspective. And so I'm going to be quiet for a minute. I'm going to let her talk and let her present some of her work. I'm going to encourage everybody to use the Q&A function and or the chat. I'll be monitoring that, so we'll have some time at the end to kind of share and have a conversation. Dr. Rivera McCutcheon, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Aleman and Trinity University. I'm really honored to be part of the National Speaker Series. I was really excited when Dr. Aleman reached out to me and scheduled this date. I know there have been some phenomenal speakers up to this point, and so I really find myself to be in good company. A couple of quick caveats. I run a zoo of animals and children. And while I have threatened the children with, all kinds of repercussions for, interrupting, they are free-willed, as are the animals. My middle daughter tends to not be aware how loud she sings, and so I may need to mute and, yell in my Puerto Rican way downstairs, but I need to give that caveat, and also the dog, right? So anyway, and you'll see cats lounging and inappropriately cleaning themselves probably in the background. So I just wanted to put that out there just so that everybody knows. So I want to get us started. I'll start sharing my screen, and I just want to start off by asking folks to think about a time that you felt cared for in school. And I want to invite you to use the chat function to just drop that in there. I like to see what folks remember. And, sometimes the question is, are you talking about college? Are you talking about, grade school? Really, the sky's the limit. As, I want you to think about when you felt cared for as a student in school. Think about what you felt, what the circumstances were, and why it stands out to you. And I'm just gonna, take a look at the chat function as stuff comes in, and then I'll continue to talk a little bit about that as I talk about my discussion of radical care and why why it's really important to me and how I came to this idea of radical care, right? So I'm seeing some when the adults treated me like a human and not a number. That's really important, right? And keep them coming. So let's see what else is coming up here. Books and cassettes to learn French, 6th grade teacher. So we often have like a very specific person, in some cases, several people. Someone told you specifically, sort of singled you out, right, as an individual. Apologies, humanizing. There you go. So I like to start with that because I think it helps ground this conversation in radical care. And I want to tell you a little bit about my experiences in schooling and how my history with my family and schooling really shaped how I've begun to think about, or I started thinking about, radical care. So, my own educational path has really shaped the way that I approach my work as an educator and as a researcher, as Dr. Aleman shared in my introduction. Right, I'm a Spanglish speaking Puerto Rican, first generation college graduate, proud of that. I grew up in a predominantly working class Black community in Queens, New York, where I attended public schools from grades kindergarten through 12th grade. My father was a transit police officer who had to retire shortly after I was born because he had multiple sclerosis. My mother was a homemaker who turned into a grassroots community organizer and activist, who's really a badass and whose impact has lasted a very long time. And they painted a mural of her and other activists in the community in honor of her. My older 2 sisters and I were, close from the very, very beginning. And I also sort of modeled and emulated their activism. And we grew up on a very fixed income in Queens, right? And it consisted solely of my father's Social Security benefits and his disability benefits. But despite these limited resources and the fact that she and my father only had high school education, my mom really knew how to advocate on behalf of us, right? So when it came time for me, I'm the baby of the family, when it came time for me to attend high school, as well as my older sisters, she really advocated for me to go to a high school that had what we would now call a STEM program. It was a small program within a larger comprehensive high school. And it really afforded me some opportunities that I might not have had if I'd attended my locally zoned high school. And these are the people that have shaped, who I am today. So I followed my middle sister to the University of Rochester, which is in upstate New York. I earned my BA in political science there, and then my master's degree in social studies education. And for those that don't know, the University of Rochester is a private, predominantly white institution. And I experienced quite a shock when I arrived, both culturally and academically. I had been at near the top of my class in this high school, which was about several thousand kids. But I really struggled in college, especially with writing. And as I reflected back, like I had never been asked to write more than maybe a 1-page paper, handwritten. There weren't like any research projects, revisions. There certainly weren't 10, 20-page type papers as my college demanded of me. And so when I entered into my master's degree, I really began to reflect on what I hadn't been taught in my K-12 years. And I began to understand that my teachers' limited expectations about me and their deficit perspectives about me and my peers, my Black and Latinx peers, had really likely hindered me academically. So in undergraduate, I had really constantly had a hard time meeting the minimum page requirements, right? It wasn't that I wasn't trying, I just wasn't getting it, right? And in the spring of my sophomore year, Dr. Karen Fields, whose name I remember because it was a moment that I felt cared for in education. She was one of the few, if only Black professors, educators in general that I'd ever had. And she gave me the first C on a paper that I'd ever earned. I generally had received A's and A minuses on my papers because my ideas were really sound, and the professors, mostly white, typically gave me the benefit of the doubt. And I want to highlight the distinction that I make in how I talk about earning a C versus receiving an A, right? Or receiving A's from multiple professors, right? So Professor Fields, this Black professor, explained to me that my writing just wasn't up to snuff, and that she wasn't going to inflate my grade like some of my white professors would. And she told me explicitly that I could and I should do better. And that was really a shock for me, right? So the mechanics of writing a cogent paper had eluded me for years. And yet the vast majority of my teachers in all of my years of schooling hadn't said a thing, right? These educators may have actually understood their ideas and their actions towards me as caring, but in fact, their actions were more closely resembling pity and lowered expectations and qualities of what I call limiting care, right? They really were thinking about doing this work in the service of children, right? Lowering the expectations for me, giving me a pass, so to speak, in the service of me, but in fact, it was actually doing more harm than good. So I go on to start my own education career as a humanities high school teacher, which was also quite a shock, right? So my ninth grade students were really so utterly underprepared that I was astounded, right? They had persisted through 7 or 8 years of schooling, having been denied access to a high quality education, and had arrived in my classroom, many of them struggling to write a basic 4-paragraph essay, right? So this wasn't their fault, right? This is about the system that had failed them. But when my colleagues and I would come across a student who could consistently write in complete sentences and maybe write a decent essay, we were over the top in our praise, right? And we declared them college ready. And so, not surprisingly, many of those students went on to college and ended up dropping out because they felt defeated by the academic rigors and the cultural shock as well. And I had lowered my expectations about what they could accomplish because of their life circumstances. And in so doing, I lowered the expectations for what I could accomplish with my students, right? And my own teaching abilities and skills, right? So by failing to demand and expect excellence of myself and of my students, I had been practicing limiting care just as my teachers had practiced limiting care with me, right? So when I began my doc studies at NYU, years later, I really had this 2 burning questions, right? So what are the conditions of schooling that contribute to this like reproductive cycle that undereducates kids that look like me, right? And more importantly, what I really was drawn to and really wanted to understand is how academic success and caring could coexist in schools that serve Black and Latinx kids, right? And that's really what has guided my work over the years, right? And very often when you talk to educators about, why did they go into the profession, among the reasons they'll share is that they care about kids, right? But one of the things I've come to learn over the years is that the way that we typically think about care isn't enough, right? It's the way it's conceptualized that isn't enough, right? The kind of care that we see or talk about in education frequently is paternalistic and superficial, right? Or it's limiting. And while my work is generally focused on school leadership, right? I really would argue that this idea of care in many aspects of our life, like we need a new approach, right? And that's what I'm calling radical care. So there are 5 components of this framework, and they're listed here. And I just want to take 1 second to shout out my eldest child, Elle, who's a senior in high school and who did the cover art for the book, who really, did an excellent job. So just always got to shout out the kids, whether they're being annoying or creative. So anyway, so I want to, they're listed here, so I won't read that to you. But what I want to emphasize is that while adopting an anti-racist mindset is at the core of radical care in leadership, really the framework should be understood as holistic and synergistic, right? So I tease it apart, of course, for the purpose of clarity and to sort of disentangle them. But in practice, they really are part of a larger whole, and they have to work in concert with one another. And so you're hopefully hear hints of this throughout the talk as I unpack it, and in the Q&A session, right? So first and foremost, radical care involves acknowledging that institutionalized and systemic racism is real, right? And that the legacy of racism has an impact on Black and Latinx and other racialized communities that have been historically marginalized, right? There's no question about that, right? And so a lot of times that makes people uncomfortable, but I don't apologize for that, because it's really essential to center this discussion on race, because it's an essential part of the work, right? So this first component, adopting an anti-racist stance, right? The key here is to recognize that racism is normal, right? It is prominent in US history, and it's certainly woven into the fabric of our modern day institutions, right? Legacy of slavery and Jim Crow era segregation and lynching is not easily purged from our institutions, right? And in fact, many argue that our institutions are organized in ways that perpetuate inequality and inequity, right? And so those white supremacists that marched in Charlottesville a few summers back are our bankers and our store owners and our police officers, our librarians, and yes, they are our educators, as were the insurrectionists on Capitol Hill, as we know, on January 6th. And if they got fired from their jobs, they're running for school board elections, right? So, we know that they are present and they have a particular mindset. Our institutions have this in them, and we need to make sure that we are explicitly and in an unwavering way focusing on anti-racism. And by centering that, right, leaders can leverage their authority to engage members of a school community or a broader community in examining their own internalized racialized superiority or their internalized oppression, and really examine the impact and legacy of racism within our institutions, right? So for white folks, anti-racism is about examining that internalized racialized superiority, right? Because we've grown up in a racist society, right? And white folks haven't been immunized from the constant reminders every day regarding your superiority and the normalcy of whiteness, right? You see the pervasive positive reflections of your likeness in media and pop culture and literature everywhere, right? And so you have to work to undo that messaging. And it begins by taking the initiative to engage in the hard work of learning about the history, right? And to engage in a thoughtful analysis about how systems work to reproduce racism. And it means confronting your own complicity in maintaining racism in your everyday interactions, but also in the systems and institutions where you have racial privilege, right? So anti-racism for white folks involves not expecting folks of color to share resources all the time or to explain to you how your actions are racist, right? It means being a co-conspirator, using your racial privilege as leverage to engage other white folks in conversations and to enter into those spaces that might not be easily accessible for someone like me, right? Or for someone like Dr. Aleman. And scholar Bettina Love, in one of her talks, which I love, talks about, whiteness as a bank account that replenishes itself, right? So she says, use that whiteness because that privilege just keeps coming back, right? You expend it and then it, surprise, it's there again. So you just have to keep using it, right? So it means that you have to engage and re-engage in reflections about yourself. Folks of color, similarly, have been bombarded with negative images about people that look like us, right? We've learned from a very young age that whiteness is a desirable norm, while everything else is undesirable, right? So for us, adopting an anti-racist mindset really also begins with deep self-reflection about the legacy of racism and the impact it's had on how we develop our own sort of sense of worth, how we internalize oppression and our own feelings of inferiority. And it involves a critical analysis of institutional oppression and a wholesale rejection of any notions of a race-neutral meritocracy, because that doesn't exist, right? We have to analyze how systems work to maintain racial oppression. At one school where I did a good deal of research for this book, Cornerstone Academy for Social Action, it's a Bronx middle school that was founded by Congressman Dr. Jamal Bowman. And anti-racist practices included explicit conversations about topics like police brutality in the Black and Latinx communities, right? And at CASA, which was the acronym, he partnered with Hip Hop Saves Lives, which is an organization that works with students using music and technology to tackle these issues head on. So I want to share a brief clip featuring a song that they wrote called "We Will Not Be Silent," and you'll see what this is about in a second.
Oh my God! I'm sorry. Oh my God! No, look at me.
Hey girl.
How you doing?
I'm fine. How you? That's your phone? That's your phone?
Oh. Hold on. What's with the hands up?
Yeah, like, what's with the answer? We're unarmed civilians, duh.
Oh, I heard about you guys. Nice to meet you.
Girl, you better put your hands up.
Oh, okay.
We will not be silent.
So, here the students are part of this not so imaginary world, right? Where Black and Latinx people have to keep their hands up and visible in order to avoid police brutality, right? And, there's some comical moments, but there's a lot of truth in this world that they're sort of imagining. But this is an example of how anti-racist work and reflection can be explicitly centered in the day-to-day work of education, right? So like the educators and the students at CASA, we really have to be unrelenting in addressing these issues of racial injustice, and to push all around those that are all around us to similarly engage in understanding that. And although sometimes the counter argument is that focusing on race really creates more discord, but the truth is that communities of color, as we know, have always been aware of race and racism, and it doesn't mean that it hasn't existed. It just was comfortable not to focus on it, particularly for white folks. And so what I argue is that radical care really demands that disruption, and the need to focus on anti-racist practices and dismantling racist structures. So the second component is cultivating authentic relationships. And in the context of schools, teachers, students, student relationships tend to focus on, sort of academic achievement. That is what people care about is the mechanics of schooling and whether or not kids are performing school well. So one of the comments in when I asked the question about remembering when you felt cared for and the idea that you were more than a number, right? So generally speaking, schools focus on, you're a level 4, you're a level 3, those are level 2s, right? And it's really about the performance of school as opposed to the actual relationships. In authentic relationships, the students are seen more than their class average or their test scores. And radical care is about demanding that authentic relationships are grounded in love and trust and in the investment in the success of others, right? And it's really critical because of the historical institutional trauma that's often part of the DNA of schools and communities, particularly in underserved communities, right? So there are layers and layers of historical pain that need to be understood and unpacked. And there's often a deep-seated distrust of institutions that comes from intergenerational experiences of being targeted and maligned, right? So every year in my class, I have my students watch Stolen Education by Dr. Aleman, because it's really important to understand how the institution has participated, the institution that's supposed to uplift has frequently participated in the oppression. And so if we don't understand that as leaders and as educators, then we can't form those authentic relationships, right? And we need to be cognizant of that history. And we need to be cognizant of the racism and the politics of power and the impact on schooling of children who've been historically oppressed. We also need to understand the joy and the resilience and the fight of communities in the face of that oppression. All of those things contribute to creating a more authentic relationship. And it moves us from the superficial and the performative to these authentic spaces, right? In a more local context, in my home community of New Rochelle, New York, I recently participated, well, in October, I participated in an environmental racism tour that was organized by a brilliant community activist and sponsored by this grassroots organization called New Rochelle Against Racism. And the conductor, while on this tour, brilliantly pulled together a timeline that juxtaposed federal and regional events and policies with events taking place more locally within, the red lettering across this slide. It chronicled over a century of the impact of environmental racism on schooling and housing in New Rochelle, right? Particularly in the Black communities, right? And we were blessed to have elders in the community who had lived through some of these historical events on the bus with us as we went through, and was able to sort of provide her own perspective and experiences, right? So imagine if we embedded this kind of thing in the curricular experiences of our students, right? It could go a long way in building these authentic relationships, right? And educators, leaders who are practicing radical care really are intentional about creating a community where the authentic relationships are central, right? They're really working to bring in the knowledge of the community, the wisdom of the community, and bridge that home knowledge with other forms of knowledge that are valued in other spaces, right? If we only focus on academic success rather than, paying attention to the needs of students, then they can't be successful, right? So we need to ask: our kids are in temporary housing? Are their families living in fear of deportation? Is mom or dad suffering from a chronic health issue? Is the child serving as the parent's translator? Or are older kids responsible for getting their siblings to school in the morning, and that's why they're late on a persistent basis? Are they hungry, right? So if we don't take into account all of those needs of the kids, we can't form these authentic relationships. We can't leverage that in order to help them improve academically, right? And school leaders have to model that, and educators in their own right, the teachers are also leading in those ways. And we need to make sure that we're taking care of that. The third component is believing in students and teachers' capacity for excellence. And I, hit on that when I talked about my own experiences in schools, and how limiting care shows up. So when we think about schools, the authentic relationships can lead to students having a greater sense of belonging and increased success, but we also have to believe in students' capacity for excellence. So we need to go the extra mile of beyond just sort of simply caring and adoring and wanting to make sure that our students are well, but really ensure that that's done in the service as well of supporting them for improved academic achievement and excellence, right? And it really, again, is about understanding the impact of racism and how that can contribute to the construction of low expectations, particularly for Black and Latinx kids, right? So folks that are practicing radical care really understand that lowered expectations for students in the short term can really severely limit students and educators' opportunities in the long term, right? We have to fundamentally believe that students are capable of meeting rigorous academic standards, provided that they have the appropriate supports from their schools and from their teachers, right? But it also means that teachers have to believe that students are capable of improvement. And this is especially important when kids arrive at our doorsteps underprepared because they've been denied access to a high quality education in prior school settings, right? We have to challenge students, even if they're lacking in the skills and believe they should have already learned. We tend to always pass it back. The high school teachers, as a former high school teacher, or the college educators, like, what were they doing in high school? High school teachers, what were they doing in middle school? And so on and so forth, right? And we need to sort of accept them, meet them where they are, and provide them with the supports to be great, to be excellent, right? So leaders that are practicing radical care create that environment where all educators believe that their students can be greater, right? And part of what we need to do is really focus on the opportunity gaps, provide those opportunities and resources for those students, right? I'm never saying we need to tell the kids to, move the bar up and then tell kids to jump that high without providing the resources. It really is about coupling those two things. right? But in order to have high expectations for kids, we also have to have high expectations for educators. We have to have high expectations for ourselves, right? So just as students are often seen as having untapped potential, there's often a narrative about educators, particularly veteran educators, that that is that, oh, they don't want to change, they're stuck in their ways, right? And we really need to reverse that, right? We need to believe that teachers and educators and leaders always have the capacity for growth, are interested in learning and pushing themselves and continuing to sort of find their learning edge. We leaders have to demand that greatness out of others, and they have to model that, right? So they have to be enthusiastic about that. They have to provide supports in terms of in the form of training and feedback for the educators. The leader has to be a public learner and demonstrate the value of taking risks and of failing and learning from failure, right? Most importantly, though, I think having high expectations for teachers requires that leaders explicitly unpack how damning and harmful lowered expectations can be for the students that they serve, right? So we have to have explicit conversations about how racism shows up in the way we teach, the way we grade, the way we organize students, right? We always have to be asking, is this rigorous enough? And if it's no, then we have to ask why, right? In one school where I was doing research a number of years ago, I was observing a professional development session, and the principal was working with teachers, and the teachers were sort of tearing apart a student's paper, and we're just saying like, oh, it's missing a thesis, it's missing this, it's missing that. And then when the principal sort of was wrapping up and saying, well, would you recommend that this student revise? The teachers were like, no, we would give them a pass. And when I noted my surprise to the principal afterwards, she said that she believed the teachers really were approaching this from a deficit perspective, right? That they lowered their standards because these kids had it so hard that it was like, well, they showed up, right? They showed up, they did something, we're just going to give them a pass, just as my teachers had done to me, and just as I had done to my students, right? And so in thinking about this, her predecessor before that had said, we should teach up to our students, right? They are capable of doing more than they, or in some cases, we can imagine, right? So he was calling this out. He was calling it out, and he was identifying the fact that they were too often lowering their expectations and limiting the students, right? And put another way, one of the things that Congressman Bowman has said is that we don't have time for grumbling, right? We're 400 years behind, and we have to be persistent, and we have to be tough, right? We've got to get it going. And it's really important to recognize that we've got this ground to make up, and we don't have the time for excuses, right? So the fourth component is leveraging power strategically. And with this component, it really focuses on the leader as the change agent. And I think that this is especially relevant in the context that you all are primarily in Texas, right? Who really is able to navigate these challenging contexts while skillfully leading the community. The key here is that the leader who practices radical care is strategic, right? They're thoughtful about how to leverage their positional authority to engage with other educators on their staff, as well as the community and the broader public, with the goals of equity and racial justice in mind. And that's not to say that that it's weaponized. Rather, the leader is practicing a radical care in a way that is considering how their power can be exercised in really thoughtful ways to enact change, and to connect with folks, right? So in the context, I'm sorry, my mouse is dying and I need to, there we go. And really it is working to think about ways to change, to shake things up, right? So they're challenging institutional norms. In this case, we're thinking about like, how do we disrupt the schedule, right? The main schedule that nobody wants to touch because it's so hard to disrupt that. And Dr. Valle spoke about this in his talk, right? About the master schedule and really using that in a strategic way to figure out how to circumvent the system that is perpetuating inequities, right? So there's challenging institutional norms, there's challenging harmful policies, and there's responding to injustice and figuring out ways to do that. In one school that I worked, that I did some research in, one of the principals really wanted to challenge a policy of increased enrollment, but he couldn't do that directly because doing that would put him directly in the line of fire. However, he had formed the authentic relationships with powerful organizations, including one in the middle there, Mothers on the Move, which is a powerhouse organization in the Bronx. And he called them up and said, listen, there's going to be a meeting. The superintendent's going to be here, and I need you to call him and give him hell. I need you to show up and give him hell and tell him that, you know, we can't increase the number of students, but don't tell him I told you to call, right? Because he knew that he needed to maintain his position in order to continue to do the sort of subversive leadership work that would advance the cause of racial equity and justice, right? And anti-racism. And this is all really important, right? The last component is embracing a spirit of radical hope, which is, I will admit, one of the hardest components, I think, for me and for a lot of people, because it's really something that stood out to me after the 2016 presidential election. And it was an essay that was written, and he talked about it's not so much something you have, but something you practice. It demands flexibility, openness, and imaginative excellence. And radical hope is our best weapon against despair, even when despair seems justifiable, right? It makes survival on the end of your world possible. And this really resonated for me, not just because of that particular pivotal and deeply toxic moment, right? It really resonated for me because it struck me as true in education as well, right? There is so much trauma that pre-pandemic that underfunded, resourced schools tend to have to sort of deal with, and feeling despair is common, right? But leaders that are practicing radical care are really tapping into this future, right? This future of possibilities, or as Robin Kelly tells us in Freedom Dreams, unless we have the space to imagine and a vision of what it means to fully realize our humanity, all the protests and demonstrations in the world won't bring about our liberation, right? So radical hope is about guarding ourselves against that despair. And it's hard to avoid sometimes when we're in these systems that do create that sense of hopelessness. But what it means is that it's really about understanding that yours is the work of generations, right? That it's not achieved overnight, that we have to continue to do the hard work, to be in community with others. And what I suggest is that we just need to figure out how to do that with more and more people, so that we're not standing on our own trying to do all of this really difficult work. And when you're in community with others, radical hope is much easier to sort of embrace. And these kids, these beautiful kids, deserve that, right? They deserve that of us, of their leaders, of their educators, is really continuing to fight for them, right? And I'll close this portion of the talk by just reminding us that I think it's really important, and something that I often think about is that just by virtue of us being here, we have a tremendous amount of privilege, right? And too often, those of us that have privilege are complicit in the reproduction of oppression, right? Whether we're aware of it or we're unaware of it, right? Sometimes it's because we're silent, we're scared, or we're frozen, right, to a point of inaction. But with our privilege comes a tremendous responsibility and an opportunity to use our power, our positions, and our access to disrupt that inequity, and work to create the world that these kids deserve. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks so much. Thanks for those words. Yeah, a lot to think about there. And I want to encourage anybody that's on the call to go ahead and use the Q&A function or the chat, and love to have a conversation. Looking at the list of folks, I know you guys have a lot to say, so don't be shy. I'll start it off because thanks again for doing the book. I know you spent a lot of time. I mean, you've been spending a lot of time with people who've been doing the work, and this is a nice book that you were able to put everything together. And my first question was really about, I love the title, Radical Care, and especially the times that we're living. You were writing this book through the former administration. You were writing this book, pre-pandemic. We've seen what's happened to the field, not only, with teachers, but with leaders that are school building leaders, and the kind of work they've been having to do over the last 2 years. And so my first question is really about, what does radical care look like after the pandemic? Is it just is this something that's kind of reinforcing the way you were feeling about it anyway? It just brings it to the forefront even more so.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for sure. I think, the sort of the theme of this year's National Speaker Series really resonated for me, because it's like, we can't just go back to normal. There's an opportunity for this radical rupture of a system, and a recreation and a reimagining of a system. At the same time, I'm aware that, I'm a New Yorker, right? And I teach in the Bronx, and, we're sort of in a liberal bubble sometimes, and really find it very hard to imagine some of the challenges that folks have outside of our liberal bubble, to do this sort of disruption. And so I do think that this is the moment to try to use that component and think about, how do I leverage my power strategically, and think about, how do I disrupt in very subversive ways. I will say that that's one thing that I've been thinking a lot about, is the essential subversive work that has to happen. And I have been thinking a lot about how much really truly transformational work has to happen in the margins, in some ways, because when it gets into the central space, it gets co-opted, and that's never good for the people it's meant to serve.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, in both of my classes that I'm teaching this semester, we have weekly reflections, and a lot of, with this work included, a lot of what folks are reflecting about and even asking about is the how. Like, how do you do that? Like, I want to do that. I want to do radical care. I want to be disruptive. I want my students to read, histories and have curriculum that's actually they're going to identify with and engage with. It's the how. How do you go about doing that? That's why I like the components that you have, because I think that's something that folks can really attach to and then make sense for themselves. The second question was about. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about your relationship and the work that you've done with the congressman, because I love his foreword. He wrote the foreword to your book, and I know that you'd been doing work with him. He's a former educator, or he's an educator. That's first and foremost what he is. Yeah. You don't oftentimes see educators become congresspersons, and so that's something that I know, very grassroots, very much about community building, very much in progressive politics, and so. When I hear you talk about leveraging your power, understanding how you can be strategic, being subversive, building coalitions, the relationships that you have with parents, with groups outside the school, can you talk a little bit about your work with the congressman and what that's made you think in terms of radical care?
Totally. I mean, as I said, one of the things that always drew me, as I sort of left teaching and went into the world of research and academia, was like, where are the really wonderful examples, right? And the first time I met Jamal, Congressman Bowman, was when he was supervising one of my interns, right? And we just started talking, and I was like, this is already amazing, right? And he leads, I think, I'm lucky enough to actually also be one of his constituents. And so he leads very much in the same way that he led as a principal. Mm-hmm. It was rare that I would find him in his office. I would step off the elevator onto the floor where his school was, and he would be, in a corner with, student desks piled up with books and a laptop and his phone, or he'd be in another corner and sort of see. And he leads in very much the same way. So it's all about the authentic relationships, right? And building those relationships then helps people develop trust, and feel as if, they can trust. And it's hard to trust a politician. It's hard to because there is a lot of compromise that has to happen, especially at that level. But working with him has been about it, even in this time is been about, a text message, right? Rosa, all caps, exclamation point. I need you to put me in contact with this person, right? It is about really building those relationships in order to do the work. Sometimes the work happens in the sort of formal channels and spaces, And a lot of the work happens in the unofficial channels and connections and networks to see what it is that people in the communities need. And that is where, again, that there's a combination. You can do that sort of subversive work when you actually have relationships with folks. Otherwise, you can't just show up and say, hey, I need this from you, and
Right.
you haven't been there.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to follow that up, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Rodriguez, former president at UCA, colleague of mine at UTSA when I was there. We all know and love her. She's got a question, and then I'll go back to Lizette, but it kind of tied to to the radical care. She's asking about self-care, given the fact that what teachers and administrators and leaders are going through right now is unprecedented, and we're seeing what's happening with openings and with just what they're facing in the schools front line. So her question is, what recommendations do you have for educators to practice self-care so that we can give the best of ourselves to our students?
I think it's really hard. I love that question, and it's so nice to see you, or to know that you are here. Thank you for being here, Dr. Rodriguez. I think one of the important things is sort of creating boundaries, right? And we're all horrible at creating the boundaries. So we actually need to create those boundaries and sort of figure out when we're going to be in community and in the sort of silent space with our families, with our loved ones. There is so much, we can, if you're an activist, if you're engaged, there's a meeting every minute,
And
every
it's
hour.
personal, and they're personal.
And it's right. That's right. So, and especially now with Zoom, there's a meeting all the time, right? You can meet and organize at any time. So that's important. But the other thing that I find really so important to my self-care is to be in community with others who are like-minded, who are going to push my thinking around these issues. The idea that iron sharpens iron, right? There are so many, if you look at my acknowledgements, there are so many wonderful women that are part of my community that I draw a lot of comfort from. And sometimes it's fun and laughter. And a lot of times it's sort of plotting to change the world, right?
Mm.
And you really need that. You can't do this work alone, which is what I talk about in talking about this idea of radical hope. It's too hard to do it alone. It's not healthy. And so we need to be in community with others.
And I love what you said earlier about we're doing work right now for the next generations or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but it's like this. It's the long game. Like
It
this
is.
is this is the long
Absolutely.
game, and we need educators, we need educational leaders to stay in the long game. And so that, I think that's why the question's great, because we have to be intentional about the way we're taking care of ourselves, and the fact that you don't do this work alone. You do this with community and in community. That's how you take care of yourself, and making sure that you balance that. I struggle with that part of it too, because people do take it like the congressman who's, I'm sure, I mean, this is a 24-hour a day type of gig. It's not like, it can be if you're not
Yeah.
setting boundaries and not
Right.
taking care of yourself.
And we have to take care of ourselves, right? Because
Yeah.
we know, and especially in our communities, we sort of suffer from illnesses and stress that kills us. And so we really need to take care, because we need to be here to do the work. And so finding those boundaries, setting those boundaries is important.
Yeah. Lizette's asking about how do you balance radical care with this idea of students' grit or ganas? What have you found is the most encouraging act that helps students push through the hard or most challenging higher expectations?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's so funny because I have a reaction to grit. Ganas, I have a different reaction to,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's just again, one of the one of the problems I have with, and I talk about this in the book, with sort of a grit analysis, not so much ganas, because I think that's different again from with our cultural norms
Right.
and cultural understandings, that it tends to put it on the kid or on the family, and it completely is devoid of any institutional analysis, right? And so the key with supporting students, particularly when they're hitting a wall, is figuring out how the schools and the institutions can adapt to support those kids, right? usually, and we know this as educators, if I've assigned a task and a good portion of my students aren't getting it, I've done something wrong. I need to do something better. I need to backtrack and scaffold it, right? That's essentially what we have to do with our students. And very often it's like, especially as a high school teacher, right? It's like, oh, well, the kids can't read. Well, they should learn how to read. Of course they should know how to read by this time, but they don't. So now what? I think the key though, and I will say, and I talk a lot about this in the book, at the end of the book, I talk about the importance of the role of the institutions of higher education, because I think we fail in preparing future educators, future leaders, by not really, engaging in the kind of work that will better support those kids that really need that. High school teachers I was not taught how to be a reading teacher or a writing teacher. But that doesn't mean that I don't have that responsibility. So how do we respond to what the needs are and do better by those students?
That's great. One more question here. It's from Danielle Miller. She's one of our students, our Masters of Educational Leadership students working in one of the high schools here in San Antonio. She's talking about, I feel like our systems of grading and testing make this radical care challenging at times. Those systems communicate to students that they are not capable and challenge our ability as educators to make them to meet them where they are. What recommendations do you have for working around those systems, since they aren't going anywhere soon? Especially today, the news came out that a lot of our leaders have been pushing to cancel the testing that we have coming up here, in the state testing that have coming up, and that's not going anywhere. The governor and the state are wanting to have these testing, processes in place, even though we've been going over the last 2 years, we have so much absences, and teachers have been struggling, but even with that, that's such a strong component of what we have policy wise here in the state. So that's what I think, that's one of the reasons she's asking that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And we know that we haven't, from the federal level, the federal totally punted that and did not really rise to the opportunity that they could have risen to. So I agree. It's really hard to try to figure out how to do, how to serve the two masters, so to speak, right? How to make sure that we provide the students with the skills that they need to get through those sort of gatekeeping moments and policies. One I would say is that we need to continue to advocate for the changes at the policy changes that will codify sort of a change in the way we approach the teaching and learning processes. And I think we have to figure out ways to teach creatively, so that we're thinking about, all right, let me unpack this test and let me figure out what is the bare bones that what are the things that we need, what's the skeleton, what's the structure of this test, and teach the kids how to take the test and figure out then how to then create opportunities for students to engage in authentic learning ways, right? How to engage in projects, how to engage with critical thinking. There are educators who are really skilled and have lots of experience in sort of doing both, right? Relegating the test prep to that, last 2 weeks and saying, all right, we're going to do this thing because we have to do it. But all the while, they're really focusing on the content that doesn't show up on the test, but that we know is important. So in New York State, we have the Regents exam. You don't typically find, a wealth of questions on those history Regents exams about the Harlem Renaissance, right? Which is such a pivotal, American sort of moment. But, it might get one question, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't do it because it's not being valued in the way that the state is valuing it. So we have to find the ways to do both of the things. I would never, and I actually think it's really unethical to not prepare students for those exams that are going to serve as barriers to opportunities, right? I don't agree with them necessarily, but I'm not necessarily going to say that we shouldn't prepare students for that. I think that's unethical. I think it would be unethical to not do the other work. So we have to sort of figure out how to fit both of them into our curriculum. And very often, it's actually much easier to figure out how to teach to the test and really get into the meaty stuff that the tests don't really measure.
I had a final question just for you. I mean, I really liked your last section on radical hope. And so, as I was reading it, the question that I had is, with the principals and the educational leaders, educators that you work with, what stands out to you the most as to how they're able to maintain, that sense of radical hope? It's not people don't always have it, but for those who do it well and those who are able to like maintain that kind of spirit that you talk about and maintain that energy and that just hope and community and it helps them to keep do the work. Like, what are some of the things that stand out to you? And even maybe it's even for you. Like, what keeps you going? Like, what keeps you with this sense of radical hope, given the times in which we are living?
Well, I think I wrote in the I wrote in the book that there are times when I'm like, this is gonna be the shortest chapter ever, because I have no hope, right? Like it's gonna be one sentence. It's like,
Yeah.
see someone else for this. But I do think, Jamal is actually the person that I often think of when I think about radical hope. I mean, he would just have this like unbelievable and almost like, are you jiving me? Like, are you
You
really?
have to be in Congress.
I mean, you have to be, but he was like this as a principal.
Yeah.
And still really this belief that like we can change the world. We just have to figure out how to do that and keep moving. For me, what works is because of course, it gets frustrating, it gets tiresome, you feel like you're not making progress. So I think two things are important. One, again, is that generational piece, right? I don't remember, I read this quote and I don't remember where, I've looked high and low, but this idea of like, ours is the work of generations.
Yeah.
That gives you so much perspective about like, there are folks that have come before us that have helped me be where I am. And
Exactly.
there will be folks that are coming after us that I need to play my part, right? And so that's one thing. The other is taking stock. And I think we often don't stop and sort of look back and say, well, what are the wins that we've actually had, right? We're so often sort of in the fight, right? And la lucha, that you just have a hard time getting perspective around, wait, we actually got rid of this person, right? It was hard in the meantime, but we were able to like galvanize and get two people elected to the Board of Education and get this superintendent that was, racist off. Like, eventually, like in the moment, it wasn't immediate. We didn't get the demands that we wanted met in the moment, right? The person was hired,
Right.
However, taking stock can be really powerful, because then you're able to sort of say, okay, well, we've made some movement.
Taking the win where there's a win, like
Where there's a win, there's a win. That's really important. Yeah. It gives you a lot of perspective and sort of re-energizes you to sort of get up and do it again.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. I love the work of generations. Derek Bell talks about that in his book on Faces at the Bottom of the Well. At the beginning of the intro, he talks about his work as a civil rights attorney and in the 1960s, going on some marches and talking to one of the descendants. Her descendants or she's a descendant of slaves, and talking. She's an 80-year-old woman in the 60s, saying, "Look, I know that not a lot going to change in the rest of my life, but she's doing this for a purpose, and she understands that just being able to be part of that struggle and just marching." Even though she's not going to see systemic structural changes in her life, her lifetime, the rest of her lifetime, that just doing that in community with other folks gives her enough pleasure to be able to do that. And she takes that as a win, and so I think we have to.
Absolutely. It is absolutely the thing that, because I find it hard. I want the immediate change, but it grounds me when I'm feeling unmoored and restless and disillusioned. Because that really is where a lot of us end up with this work. And at this time, right? Disillusionment is real, and just sort of like, that's it. I can't do this anymore. But you got to show up in the ways that woman talks about.
Yeah. Well, we're right up against time, and this hour flew by. I could talk to you for another couple of hours. I wanted to thank you for taking the time. I know you're super busy, but I wanted our folks down here to hear from you directly, and I'm going to plug it again. Radical Care: Leading for Justice in Urban Schools. It's a great read, and I know you put a lot of heart and soul into it. Now I'm going to love it even more because I didn't know your child did the cover. That's awesome.
Yes. Yes, she did. Yes, she did. And my
Getting what
other
percentage?
child, my other child did my little website. So, they're very
What-
talented. And I guess,
Yeah, that's awesome.
but
Well,
thank you. I really appreciated it. And I love to be in conversation and welcome, your students and others who are listening to reach out. I'm happy to talk about this and get my own thinking pushed.
absolutely. Just wanted to remind everybody, thank you for attending tonight. I wanted to remind you, next month's speaker, Dr. Ann Ishimaru, on March 21st. Look out for the flyer on that. And again, thank you to Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutcheon for spending time with us and sharing your knowledge. We really appreciate it. Everybody have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks.